name is Elias. I am 52 years old and have been a gravedigger for over 2 decades. I never cared much about the stories people tell about cemeteries, ghosts, hauntings, and such. For me, it was just my job, taking care of the graves, keeping the place tidy and respecting the dead. But everything changed one night I will never forget. It was a Thursday, and the cemetery was quieter than usual. It was winter, and the wind whistled between the graves. The full moon partially illuminated the place, but the shadows of the trees made the scene even more somber. As usual, I finished my last round around 10 o'clock at night and went back to the gatehouse. There was an old radio there playing some random music, and I sat down to drink a coffee. Everything was quiet until I heard a peculiar sound, a metallic creaking, as if something was moving. At first, I thought it was the main gate swaying in the wind, but when I looked out the window, I realized that the sound was coming from another direction. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. The noise led me to the west side of the cemetery, where the oldest graves are. It's an area that rarely sees visitors, with mausoleums of forgotten families and worn-down headstones. As I approached, I noticed that the iron door to one of these mausoleums was ajar. That was odd, because I was sure it had been closed when I'd last made my rounds. My heart raced, but I kept going. I shone my flashlight on the door and saw rusty scratch marks on the metal, as if someone had forced their way out. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal that had hidden inside. Must be a cat. I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. I pushed the door slowly, and it creaked open with a loud sound that seemed to echo throughout the cemetery. Inside, everything was as it always had been. Old coffins piled high, cobwebs, the smell of dust and wet earth. I used my flashlight to sweep around the interior, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. I slammed the door shut and locked it, determined to ignore it. But as I walked back to the lobby, I felt something. An uneasy feeling that I was being watched. The wind seemed to stop, and silence took over. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped immediately and turned the flashlight, but there was no one there. The sound continued, as if someone were following me a few feet away. My heart was hammering in my chest. I wanted to run, but something was holding me back. I tried to shout, "Who's there?" No answer, just the sound of footsteps, this time closer. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and the cold feeling grew stronger. I took a deep breath and took another step, but the footsteps behind me followed suit. When I finally summoned the courage to look again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow standing among the graves, motionless. I couldn't make out the face, but it was a man in an old suit, standing there, staring at me in the darkness. The light from my flashlight didn't seem to reach him completely, as if he were out of place. "Are you lost?" I asked, trying to sound confident, but my voice was weak. He didn't answer. We stood like that for what seemed like hours, until he took a step toward me. That was enough to make me flinch. But instead of continuing toward me, he slowly turned and began walking toward the mausoleum. I watched him, unable to move. He entered the mausoleum and, without touching the door, disappeared inside. I stood there, frozen, as the wind picked up again and the trees rustled. I couldn't finish my rounds that night. I went back to the gatehouse and locked myself in there until dawn. I can still hear the sound of those footsteps, even now, every time I pass that side of the cemetery. It was just the beginning, but I already knew that something was very wrong with that place. After that night, I avoided the west side of the cemetery for days. Something about that experience made me uneasy. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all. After all, I had been working there for years, often alone, and isolation could play tricks on the mind. But when the next Thursday rolled around, a series of events proved to me that it was more than just imagination. It was an ordinary day, with few burials scheduled. The weather was overcast, and a light mist was beginning to form in the evening. I was finishing cleaning the central section of the cemetery when I spotted a familiar figure in the distance, that same man. He was standing among the old headstones, wearing the same black suit I had seen the week before. He was staring at one particular grave, as still as a statue. My first instinct was to ignore him, but there was something about the way he stood there, as if he didn't belong there, or maybe he belonged more than I did. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, even though it was still daylight, and walked toward him. As I got closer, I began to feel a strange chill that seemed to radiate from the ground. The fog made it hard to see clearly, but I could have sworn he wasn't standing on dirt. His shoes barely touched the ground. "Are you okay, sir? Do you need help?" I asked when I was a few feet away from him. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the headstone, until he finally turned to me. It was at that moment that something inside me froze. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes had a hollow glow, as if there was no life in them. But most disturbingly was what he said. "She shouldn't have been buried here." I swallowed hard, trying to process his words. I looked at the headstone he was staring at. It belonged to a woman named Ana Clara dos Santos, who had died in 1947. There was nothing special about the headstone, except that it was covered in moss and looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. "Who shouldn't be here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a moment, as if deciding whether he could trust me. Then he said, "Ana, she's not at peace." The way he said it made my stomach churn. There was something in his voice, a mix of sadness and certainty that was almost impossible to ignore. "Did you know this woman?" I asked, trying to make sense of what was happening. He smiled slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I did. We all do. Before I could ask what he meant, he began walking slowly west, toward the same mausoleum as the week before. My body felt paralyzed, but I forced my legs to move and followed him. This time, I was determined not to let him disappear. When we reached the mausoleum, he stopped at the entrance and looked over his shoulder at me. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked. I wanted to lie, to say I didn't know what he was talking about, but the words stuck in my throat. Because I did. There was something wrong with this place, something that couldn't be explained. Then he placed his hand on the door of the mausoleum and muttered something I couldn't understand. The door opened slowly, but what happened next took my breath away. Inside, the interior of the mausoleum was different. Gone were the old, dusty coffins I had seen before. Instead, the floor was covered in fresh dirt, and a single dark wooden coffin sat in the center. The man looked at me once more, this time with a somber expression. "If you don't do something, she'll remain trapped." "Trapped to what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To pain, to death, to what they did to her." Before I could ask him anything else, he stepped into the mausoleum and disappeared, as if he had dissolved into thin air. I ran inside, but there was no sign of him, just the dark wooden coffin and the smell of wet earth. That night, for the first time in all my years as a gravedigger, I left the cemetery before my shift ended. I closed the main gate and walked away, feeling like this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something I wasn't prepared to face. After that second sighting, the thought of returning to the cemetery made me uneasy. But work was my only source of sustenance. I spent the entire day trying to forget what had happened, but the man's words echoed in my head. "If you don't do anything, she'll stay trapped." That night, the cemetery felt different. It wasn't just the silence, nor the darkness, that grew thicker. It was as if the very air carried something heavy, hard to breathe. I grabbed my flashlight and made my rounds, avoiding the west side as much as possible. But a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a low moan, almost a groan, coming from where the mausoleum stood. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. With my hand shaking, the flashlight in the other, I walked toward the sound. When I got close to the mausoleum, I noticed that the door was open again, as if inviting me to enter. For a moment, I considered leaving, but something was pulling me, a mixture of curiosity and fear that I couldn't ignore. I walked in slowly, my eyes fixed on the dark wooden coffin that was in exactly the same place. The smell of earth was stronger now, and the air felt cold, despite it being summer. The wailing continued, coming from inside the coffin. "This can't be happening," I whispered, as my body shuddered. I decided to do something I never imagined. I opened the coffin. The lid was heavy, and my hands were shaking so much that it took me a few seconds to gather my courage. When I finally lifted the lid, what I saw took my breath away. The coffin was empty. There was no body, just a thin layer of dirt at the bottom. But the strangest thing was what was mixed in with the dirt, a golden chain, like a necklace, with a small medallion. I picked up the object, even though I felt like I shouldn't, and looked closely. Inside the medallion was a black and white photograph of a woman. It was Ana Clara dos Santos, the same woman whose name was on the tombstone the man was looking at. The morning stopped instantly, and silence once again took over the place. But before I could process what was happening, I felt a movement behind me. I turned quickly, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and saw something that made my blood run cold. The man was there, standing at the entrance to the mausoleum, watching me with a sad expression. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said, his voice calm but filled with something that seemed like a warning. "Who are you? What's going on here?" I asked, my voice almost cracking. He took a step forward, and I could see something strange. Despite his human appearance, he made no shadows in the light of my flashlight. "I am someone who carries the weight of what was done to her, and now you do too." Before I could ask what he meant, he pointed to the medallion in my hand. "Keep this. You'll need it." "Need it for what?" I insisted, panicking. "Now." He didn't answer. He just turned and started walking out of the mausoleum. This time I didn't follow him. I stood there, feeling the weight of the chain in my hand and the emptiness growing inside me. When he disappeared into the fog, I looked back at the empty coffin and the medallion. Something was terribly wrong, and I was sure the worst was yet to come. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the lobby, holding the medallion and thinking about what the man had said. "You're going to need it." The feeling that I had crossed an invisible line was inescapable, and deep down, I knew that whatever it was, Ana Clara dos Santos was not yet at peace. The next night I returned to the cemetery with a sense of heaviness I had never felt before. It wasn't just fear. It was as if I were about to uncover something that should have remained buried. The medallion I had taken from the coffin would not leave my pocket, and every time I touched it, I felt a chill. I spent much of the night walking through the cemetery, trying to avoid the mausoleum. But it seemed as if the cemetery itself was pushing me in that direction. At 3 a.m., when the darkness was at its deepest and the silence at its most eerie, something happened. First, the wind stopped. Not a mere cessation of movement, but an absolute silence, as if the world had held its breath. Then I began to hear footsteps. Not my own, but those of someone slowly approaching. I looked around, shining the flashlight, but saw nothing. "Who's there?" My voice was weaker than I expected. The footsteps stopped and a whisper filled the air. "Go to her." I felt a shiver run down my spine, and against all my instincts I began walking towards the mausoleum. The door was open, as it had been the nights before, but this time something seemed different. As I got closer, I noticed that Ana Clara's tombstone, the one the man had been looking at, was glowing with a faint, almost ethereal light. With the flickering flashlight in my hands, I crouched down in front of the tombstone. Her name seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. It was then that I noticed something strange. The earth around the tombstone was disturbed, as if it had been recently dug. My heart raced. I grabbed a shovel that was nearby and began digging, not knowing exactly what I was looking for. With each blow, the sound of the shovel hitting the earth seemed to echo louder until it hit something solid. It was another coffin. Unlike the mausoleum, this one was old, its wood dark and rotting. With trembling hands, I forced the lid open, revealing a woman's body, perfectly preserved, as if it had just been placed there. It was Ana Clara. But what was most terrifying was what was in her hands. Another golden chain, identical to the medallion I had found. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly and saw the man, standing there, watching me with a somber expression. "Now you understand, don't you?" he said. "Understand what?" My voice came out in a desperate whisper. "She was buried twice, once for love and once for fear." He pointed to the medallion I was holding and the one in her hands. "Those medallions are the keys. They keep her trapped." My mind was spinning. Everything seemed surreal, but the presence of that man and what I saw before me didn't give me anything to worry about.